Learn to keep going when nothing seems to work. 1. The difference between temporary defeat and failure. There is a distinction that separates every person who eventually succeeds from every person who quits exactly one step too early. And it is this: temporary defeat is not failure. Temporary defeat is simply a signal that your current method needs revision. Failure is the decision, made entirely by you, to stop trying. The world is full of circumstances that will hand you what feels like undeniable proof that you should give up. The rejection, the empty bank account, the door closed for the third time in a row. None of those circumstances are failure. They become failure only at the exact moment you decide they are, and not 1 second before. Every difficult stretch of your life right now, no matter how convincing it looks, is temporary defeat, wearing a costume designed to look permanent. Learn to see through that costume, and you've already taken the first step that most people never take. 2. Why difficulty is the test of definiteness. A vague wish collapses at the first sign of resistance because there was never enough structure behind it to survive contact with difficulty. A definite purpose fixed clearly in the mind with a specific aim and a specific reason behind it behaves entirely differently. It bends under pressure rather than breaking because pressure was always part of what it was built to withstand. This is why the hardest seasons of your life are not punishment. That's simply the test that separates a passing interest from a definite purpose. If your aim survives the test, you now know, with certainty rather than hope, that it was real all along. 3. The power of a burning desire. Mild interest dies the moment the path gets difficult. A burning desire does not, because it was never dependent on the path being easy in the first place. The difference between these two states is not intensity of feeling in a single moment. It is durability of feeling across many difficult moments, stacked one after another, over months and years. Cultivate the kind of desire that doesn't ask whether today's circumstances are favorable before deciding whether to keep moving. A desire that needs favorable conditions to survive was never strong enough to begin with. A desire built to survive unfavorable conditions is the only kind that ever sees its goal completed. 4. Persistence as the iron will. Persistence is not a personality trait some people are born with and others are not. It is a decision, renewed daily, sometimes hourly, made by an act of will rather than an act of mood. On the days your motivation disappears entirely, and it will disappear repeatedly without warning, persistence is what continues the work anyway, without waiting for motivation to return first. This is the part most people misunderstand about persistence. It was never meant to feel inspired. It was meant to function exactly when inspiration is nowhere to be found, because that is precisely when it is needed most. 5. Why most men quit one step before the breakthrough. There is a tragic and remarkably common pattern across nearly every account of struggle and eventual success. The quitting almost always happens in the exact stretch right before the turning point, the stretch where the resistance is at its absolute highest, which is also, without exception, the stretch right before that resistance finally breaks. You cannot see the turning point coming from inside the difficulty. It does not announce itself in advance. It simply arrives suddenly after a long enough stretch of continued effort, and the tragedy is that so many stop exactly one effort short of reaching it, having no way of knowing how close they actually were. 6. The habit of faith under pressure. Faith in the sense that matters here is not blind hope detached from effort. It is a disciplined, repeated decision to act as though the outcome you're working toward is achievable, even while every visible piece of evidence currently suggests otherwise. This kind of faith is a habit, not a single feeling experienced once and then assumed to last forever. It has to be renewed deliberately, especially during the exact stretches where evidence is thinnest, because that is when the habit is doing its real work. Faith that only shows up when things are going well was never actually faith. It was simply comfort, mistaken for conviction. 7. Turning adversity into advantage. Every difficulty carries within it the seed of an equivalent advantage, hidden almost always in a form unrecognizable at first glance. This is not a comforting platitude offered to soften pain. It is a practical discipline, the deliberate habit of searching every setback for what it's actually teaching you. what skill it's forcing you to develop, what weakness it's exposing before that weakness could cause far greater damage later. The person who searches for this seed consistently begins to experience adversity differently than the person who simply endures it and waits for it to pass. One person is gathering material, the other is simply suffering. Both are experiencing the same difficulty. Only one of them is being built by it. 8. The subconscious mind during crisis. Beneath your conscious awareness, a second mind is constantly receiving instructions from your dominant thoughts and emotions. And during crisis, this is exactly when its instructions matter most. A mind repeatedly fed thoughts of defeat, scarcity, and hopelessness during hard times will produce a subconscious orientation toward defeat, scarcity, and hopelessness, regardless of what the conscious mind claims to believe on the surface. A mind deliberately repeatedly fed thoughts of capability, resourcefulness, and eventual breakthrough, even while struggling, builds an entirely different subconscious orientation, one that quietly shapes the decisions, the posture, and the energy a person carries into every difficult day that follows. 9. Autosuggestion as a weapon against despair. Despair grows in silence and in repetition. The same thought replayed without resistance again and again until it feels less like a thought and more like a fact. The antidote operates by the exact same mechanism, turned in the opposite direction. A deliberately chosen, repeated statement of capability and purpose spoken with feeling rather than recited blankly retrains the same repetitive pathway despair was using against you. This is not self-deception. It is redirection, the conscious choice to feed the same machinery a different instruction until the new instruction becomes as automatic as the old one once was. 10. The mastermind principle in dark times. No person, however strong, was ever meant to carry the hardest seasons of life entirely alone. And the belief that strength means isolation is one of the most damaging misunderstandings of what real strength actually requires. A small group of trusted minds, aligned around your purpose, offering honest counsel and steady support, multiplies your capacity to endure difficulty in ways solitary effort never can. This is not weakness. It is simply recognizing that combined minds working in harmony toward a shared aim generate a kind of resilience no single mind can manufacture entirely on its own. 11. Why specialized knowledge isn't enough without persistence. Knowledge alone has never been sufficient to overcome a difficult season. And the person who believes otherwise is often the first to abandon their effort the moment knowledge stops producing immediate results. Specialized knowledge is simply raw material. It requires the organizing force of sustained, persistent action to become anything useful at all. A library full of the correct information accomplishes nothing on its own. It is the person who keeps applying that information repeatedly through repeated discouragement who eventually transforms it into results. Persistence is not separate from knowledge. It is the engine that knowledge requires in order to move anywhere at all. 12. The 6 ghosts of fear. There are a handful of fears that haunt nearly every person moving through genuine difficulty. The fear of poverty, the fear of criticism, the fear of ill health, the fear of lost love, the fear of old age, and the fear of death itself. Each of these fears, left unexamined, quietly directs behavior from the shadows, causing hesitation, premature retreat, and self-sabotage disguised as caution. The discipline here is not pretending these fears don't exist. It is naming them specifically, examining each one directly in the light, and recognizing that nearly all of them are exaggerated far beyond their actual probability by a mind left undisciplined during difficult seasons. 13. Organized planning through chaos. Difficult seasons tend to produce chaotic thinking, scattered effort, and reactive decision-making, all of which make hard circumstances even harder to navigate. The discipline of organized planning, even simple planning, even planning revised daily as new information arrives, creates a structure that chaos cannot easily dissolve. This isn't about predicting every outcome in advance. It's about giving your effort a defined shape so that even on the hardest days, there is a next clear action available, rather than an open, formless panic with nowhere obvious to direct your remaining energy. 14. The decision to continue. At some point in nearly every difficult stretch, continuing stops being about motivation, strategy, or even visible progress. It becomes simply a decision made deliberately, sometimes through gritted teeth. To take one more action today, regardless of how the last 100 actions appear to have gone. This decision, repeated daily, is the actual mechanism behind nearly every account of eventual success that looked from the outside like overnight breakthrough. There was no single dramatic moment. There was simply a decision renewed every day, long enough that the renewal itself eventually produced the result. Why setbacks carry hidden seeds of opportunity. Look carefully at any major opportunity in your life so far, and you will likely find a setback buried somewhere in its origin story. A job lost that redirected you toward a better one. A relationship ended that made room for one far healthier. A failure that forced a skill you would have never developed otherwise. This pattern is not coincidence, repeating itself by luck. It is the structural relationship between disruption and redirection. Every setback disrupts a path that was in some way not the optimal one, even when that wasn't visible at the time. The seed is rarely obvious immediately. It usually only becomes visible in hindsight, which is exactly why faith, discussed earlier, has to operate before the seed is visible, not after. 16. The discipline of the daily habit. Difficult seasons are rarely overcome through single dramatic acts of heroism. They are overcome through small, repeated, almost unremarkable daily habits sustained long after the initial motivation that started them has completely disappeared. The habit of showing up to the work regardless of mood. The habit of feeding the mind deliberately chosen thoughts rather than whatever thoughts arrive uninvited. The habit of taking one more action today, however small, in the direction of the purpose. None of these habits feel significant in any single instance. Their power comes entirely from repetition, compounded silently day after day until the daily becomes the permanent. 17. Outlasting the storm. Every storm, regardless of its severity, operates on a timeline that eventually ends, even though that timeline is never visible from inside the storm itself. The discipline required here is not predicting exactly when the storm will end. It is structuring your conduct, your habits, and your mindset as though you intend to still be standing whenever it finally does. This means protecting your health, your relationships, and your resources as carefully as possible during the difficulty, rather than sacrificing all of them in a desperate attempt to end the storm faster than its natural timeline allows. Many people who eventually succeed were not the ones who ended their storm sooner. They were simply the ones who outlasted it, intact enough to actually use the calm that eventually followed. 18. The cumulative effect of small persistent acts. A single persistent act, viewed in isolation, rarely looks impressive. It is only the accumulation of many such acts, sustained across a difficult season, that eventually produces a result large enough to be noticed by anyone watching from outside. This is precisely why persistence feels so unrewarding while it's happening. Each individual act of continuing looks small, insignificant, barely worth mentioning. It is only much later, looking backward across the accumulated total, that the true size of what was actually built becomes visible. Trust the accumulation. Even when no single day inside it looks like much of anything on its own. 19. Why comparison kills momentum. Difficult seasons become exponentially harder the moment they're compared against someone else's apparently easier path. Someone else's apparently faster timeline. Someone else's apparently smoother circumstances. This comparison accomplishes nothing productive. It simply adds a second layer of suffering. Not just the difficulty itself, but the additional belief that the difficulty is somehow uniquely unfair compared to what everyone else seems to be experiencing. The discipline here is returning attention repeatedly to your own path alone, measured only against your own previous position, because that is the only comparison that has ever produced useful information. 2020, the Inner Council of Advisors. Even in moments of complete isolation, it is possible to consult in imagination the wisdom of those whose character and accomplishment you admire most, asking deliberately what they might do faced with your exact circumstance. This is not superstition. It is a disciplined use of imagination to access reasoning patterns you may not yet have fully developed on your own, borrowed temporarily from models you respect, until your own judgment has matured enough to no longer need the borrowing. Many of the most resilient people in history have used some version of this practice during their hardest seasons, consulting an inner counsel built entirely from admired character rather than waiting for an external advisor who may not be available in the exact moment of need. 21. Transmuting pain into purpose. Pain, left unexamined and undirected, simply causes suffering and nothing more. Pain, deliberately redirected toward a clear purpose, becomes fuel of a kind that comfort can never produce. This redirection is not automatic. It requires a conscious decision to ask what this pain can be transformed into rather than simply asking when this pain will end. The people who emerge from the hardest seasons of life with the most strength are very often the ones who found a way to point their pain at something constructive, rather than simply absorbing it without direction until it dissolved into bitterness instead of purpose. 22, the final stretch before success. There is a particular quality to the final stretch before a difficult season resolves, and it rarely feels like victory approaching. It often feels like the hardest, most exhausting part of the entire ordeal, precisely because the resistance is concentrated most heavily right before it finally gives way. This is consistent with the pattern described earlier. The breakthrough hides directly behind the most difficult stretch, not behind an easier one. If your current difficulty feels like the hardest it has ever been, that is not necessarily evidence you are losing ground. It may simply be evidence that you are closer to the end of it than you currently have any way of measuring. 23, becoming unshakable. A person becomes unshakable not by avoiding difficulty, but by accumulating enough evidence, gathered through direct experience, that they have already survived difficulty before and emerged from it intact. Each difficult season survived adds to a kind of internal evidence file, proof gathered firsthand that this person specifically can endure hardship and continue functioning afterward. Over enough repetitions, this evidence becomes more convincing than any fear trying to argue otherwise, and the person carrying it begins to move through new difficulty with a calm that looks, from the outside, almost like fearlessness, even though it is something more durable than fearlessness. It is simply earned confidence, built one survived season at a time. 24. The quiet triumph. When the difficult season finally resolves, and nearly every one of them eventually does, for those who continue showing up to the daily habits described throughout this lecture, the resolution rarely arrives with the dramatic announcement people imagine while they're still inside the struggle. It arrives quietly, almost unremarkably, often recognized only in hindsight as the moment everything finally shifted. This quiet quality is not a disappointment. It is simply consistent with how nearly everything of real, lasting value actually arrives, not through a single dramatic event, but through the accumulated weight of persistence, daily decision, and disciplined thought, finally pressing through into visible form. Keep going. Not because the outcome is guaranteed in the way you'd prefer to have it guaranteed, but because every account of eventual success worth studying shares this exact same quality. The person simply continued. Long after continuing stopped feeling reasonable, until continuing was the only thing left standing between them and the result they had been working toward the entire time.